This interview is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History.
It's a joy for me today to have the opportunity to talk to Congressman John Dingell, who has served in Congress longer than anyone else in history. That's an awesome record.
It's good luck, Glenn.
You've had probably since, what was it, February, when you became the longest serving member?
February
of this year. There's been a lot of recognition of that. Is there anything stands out in terms of those celebrations or the recognition that you've enjoyed?
The big thing is the kindness of the people.
Yeah.
It's remarkable how gracious and good and kind they've been, both here in Michigan and in my district, and of course down in Washington.
Right.
Debbie and I have a lot of friends, and they've been very good to us at this time.
You went into Congress, were you elected in 1955?
December 13th.
Okay, and you succeeded your father who passed away at that time?
He died in September on the 19th.
Okay.
And he was elected to Congress, as you'll remember, in 1932.
32 to 55. Right?
And so on the strength of his good name and distinguished record, I was lucky enough to get elected.
What was his agenda? What did he care most about in the
Well, Dad was a New Dealer.
Okay.
Dad was one of the philosophers of the New Deal.
Uh-huh.
Dad was a fellow who had come up as a poor Polish boy on the west side of Detroit with all the problems that carried with it. Detroit during that time and most of the Polish community were not doing financially very well. As a matter of fact, a lot of them, including our family, were dirt poor. But they were good, they were churchgoers, and they founded St. Casimir's Parish. Those things formed Dad. Dad was fired for union activity in 1914, so he became a strong trade unionist, both in his personal views and in his professional life.
Who did he, in what plant did he work, or with what company at the time he was fired?
1914 was the date of the firing. I won't tell you the company.
Okay.
But they're still in business, and they're friends of mine, and they were friends of Dad's, but they were not friendly towards unions at that particular time. As a matter of fact, that was a very bad union time. Union people used to wear their union buttons under their lapels or inside their hat. And but anyway, Pop was author of Section 7A of the Wagner Act, which allowed unions to organize and bargain together collectively over work and conditions of work and wages and employment. He was the originator of the fight for national health insurance. And he and Senators Murray and Wagner introduced what became the Dingell-Murray-Wagner bill. And that was the thing over which much of the fighting was done to create a program of single-payer national health insurance. Roosevelt intended to do that in 1936, but there was a war coming on, and there was an economic downturn that hit, and Roosevelt ran into some political heavy-going because of his attempt to pact with the Supreme Court. And so the wheels came off that particular wagon. Dad was also one of the early conservationists, wrote Dingell-Murray-Wagner, which has put billions of dollars into conservation. It was the second really great federal conservation bill. It dealt with fishermen putting a excise tax on fishing tackle and products of that kind, followed on Pittman-Robertson, which put a tax on firearms and ammunition, all of which channeled through into the states to enable them to fund their state conservation programs. And it's turned out to be a tremendously successful program, and it's still one of the great programs, very much revered by state conservation agencies. Dad had to get it, an interesting story is Dad had to get it through over Truman's veto. Truman vetoed it. Dad was a loyal Democrat and a good friend of Truman. Dad took the veto. He didn't try to override it. But then after the session was at end, he went down to see Truman. He wrote Truman a letter, which I still have in my files, in which he says he's been a good soldier, has helped Truman, and he hoped that Truman and Dad's good friend John Snyder, who is the Secretary of Treasury, would work with him to resolve the differences so that this could become law. Privately told John Snyder, the Secretary of Treasury, that if they didn't play the right game with him on this, there'd be no tax legislation that Truman wanted out of Ways and Means Committee. And Pop was a fellow who was fully capable of making good on any threat of that kind. Well, the upshot of the whole business was that it was finally passed, became law, and it's been a great success ever since. Dad wrote over 22 major amendments to the Social Security Act. As a matter of fact, he wrote about 100. And as you know, Social Security is a very broad law, and it's one of the safety net provisions that has, quite frankly, kept this economy going during this economic downturn, because it included things like unemployment comp and Medicare and a wide array of other things. And of course, Dad was the original author of Medicare, which I had the privilege of seeing to it pass the House. And as a matter of fact, John McCormick, my dad's good friend, let me preside over the House when we passed it.
McCormick was Speaker at the time.
John McCormick was a Speaker, wonderful man, had the soul of an Irish poet, was a great friend of my dad and I, and was one of my important mentors as I grew up.
You had been around Congress when your dad was there. Were you living in D.C.?
At that time, we would be in Washington during the time the House was in session, which shortly after Dad came to Congress, they passed the lame duck amendment, which meant that the Congress came in January. And then because of the heat and the nastiness in the summer in Washington, which is very, very unpleasant, they would adjourn around the 1st of June and everybody go home. Well, they air-conditioned the Capitol and the war came on, so of course the Congress then went year-round, and as a result, Dad would take the family down to Washington when the session started, and he'd bring us home when it was over. So in my very early days, I would go down with Dad and the family, and then we would come home when the session adjourned. And if there's business left over, the President would have a special session around the 1st of October. And then when the war came along, of course, we were there year-round, and we didn't get home much anymore. And the Congress would stay down there for the whole year because they had to, because we were fighting a war. Session would start on January 3rd, end New Year's night, or rather New Year's Eve at midnight, and they'd oftentimes have to set the clock back so that there was not the appearance of violation of law by exceeding the time that the House and the Senate were supposed to be in session because of the workload of the war.
Had you ever run for office before the 55?
I ran for precinct delegate,
and
interestingly enough, I lost. The guy who was precinct delegate out there.
Well, it's good of us to bring that up, yes.
Was pretty good, and he worked like hell. Frankly, he beat me. And that was a very important lesson, because I learned if you're going to run for office, you better put everything you got in.